Okay, let's get started. I have one prayer request tonight. Some of you knew Andrew Counterman. He was on the board at Maranatha. I don't know if he still is or not. He was actually on the Israel trip that Lynn and I took along with his wife, and so we got to know them. Well, this morning, their oldest son, Caleb, was on the way to church, hit an icy spot, the car rolled over, and the Lord took him home. So Caleb Counterman, just bang, just like that. From the picture, he looked about 40 maybe. I really don't know, but you know, you say tomorrow's not promised to us, neither is tonight, you know. So we need to remember the Countermans tonight in prayer. Does anybody have anything else you'd like for us to mention in prayer tonight? Dick.
We had a gentleman and his wife, after church, they fell in the parking lot.
Both of them? Both of them?
Both of them.
Wow.
She was trying to hold him up because he's on a cane quite a bit, and they both went down.
Wow.
Fortunately, they're okay, but she got a real bad bruised hip out of it. Name's Judy and Bert.
Judy and Bert. Okay, interesting. Today the high was supposed to be 50. I think it got up to 52. Wednesday night the low is 0. So that's Wisconsin.
Alex and Nicole are traveling to Michigan and then they're flying to Florida. So just be in prayer for all that.
Okay, the Boyles, Michigan, and then Florida.
Yeah.
So 3 things so far. Caleb Counterman, the couple Judy and Bert that both fell, and then the Boyles traveling to Michigan and Florida. Aaron, can I call on you to lead in prayer? Got those 3? Okay, anything else? Yes, thank you. Pray for the cantata Sunday. Two of the men from the center have expressed a concern about, or an interest in coming, and I plan to invite the rest of the ones tomorrow. So sometimes people will come to that where they won't come to just a normal service. So, okay, Aaron, this is your moment to shine, and welcome to all of you who are watching live stream.
Lord, thank you so much for this time tonight where we can learn more about you and learn more about the context of the Bible and how it was written and how that can help us study in our own daily life. I would just pray for these requests that were brought forward tonight. Pray for the Boyles that are flying to Florida for safety there. Pray for the cantata. We know that there was several unsafe people that were invited. I just pray that that would be a ministry to them and that the gospel message would be clear, that they wouldn't just hear some good music, but also make a decision of faith while they're there. Just pray for Judy and Bert who fell and hurt themselves. Sounds like not serious, but still. Just pray for them to Lord, and pray for the countrymen with the county men, I believe, or with the death of their son. Just never easy to lose a family member at any age, let alone someone still relatively young and unexpected. Lord, just pray that you would bring them closer to you during this time, and that if there be any unsafe people at the funeral, really understand how short life is as well. Just pray that we learn a lot this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. I will probably forget to say this if I don't say it now. If you're familiar with the holiday train, which I have never seen it before, just saw pictures of it, but it's going to be at the Silver Lake Crossing in the downtown area at 6:30 tonight. So when we're done, if you're interested in going over there, it's supposed to be a train with a lot of Christmas decorations and things like that. So I told some of the parents with kids about that, and they may go over. We are on page 6, top of page 6, clothing. A lot of the clothing, as we back up here, okay, we'll get to that in just a minute. But their clothing wasn't what we would consider drab. Here are some examples of, and you probably, you know, Aaron, when you were a kid, did they still have flannel graph? Okay, so you probably saw figures like this in flannel graph. I didn't know that. Leo, do you still use that? Okay. We got pretty high tech beyond that. Anyway, that gives you a good idea. Some of it was very colorful. It wasn't just drab and unattractive. Some had elaborate embroidering, and of course, most of their clothes were homemade. What would be the option to homemade? Well, somebody else made it for them. Maybe they had factory groups of people that got together and did that. But I remember when we were at Nazareth, there was some people there with a loom making, I don't know what it was, a rug or something like that. They made, you know, they had to. They made their own clothing. So the outer garment was often called a cloak, and it was used like we would use a jacket or a sports coat, something of that nature. And sometimes it was little more than a square of fabric with a hole in the middle for the weaver's head, wearer's head, and they just wear it like that. Number 2 there, men would not enter the temple without one. No cloak, no temple. And reminds me of when we went to the Wailing Wall up on the Temple Mount. You had to have a hat, and I was going to bring my, do you remember what those are called? No, I always forget. I don't know if you did a picture of one of those. I was going to bring mine, and with all that, we had a house full of company this afternoon, and I barely got here in time. I had a chance to look my notes over. I forgot to bring it. Maybe I'll remember next time. But they had a bin full of them there in case you didn't bring a hat along. If you were going to go up by the Wailing Wall, you had to have a head covering. And so the same thing was due with back then with a cloak. A cloak was a prized garment. It was often the focus of considerable personal pride. And when someone fell into financial difficulty, he could surrender his cloak as collateral. Why a cloak, do you think, of all things? So, you know what collateral is, money you put down promising to pay back or whatever. Why a cloak? Any thoughts on that? Yeah. There was a multi-purpose garment. It wasn't just something for show. It was a very prized garment, and often in Bible days, people only really had maybe 1 or 2 changes of clothing. And so the cloak was, you wrapped yourself up in it at night to try to keep warm. And so in Matthew, well, before we get to that, number 4 there, the spreading of cloaks at the triumphal entry of Christ in Jerusalem was a gesture of honor. So a cloak, if it was used as collateral, had to be returned to the original owner by nightfall because it was used as a blanket at night. And so, there are verses that talk about that. In Matthew chapter 5 and verse 40, the Bible says, if any man will sue thee at the law and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And so the coat was the inner garment, not what we would think of as a coat, but it was an inner garment. And so the picture that Linda had up there before, you see the cloaks here, different kind of cloaks here. And then back before that, there you can see the one second from the left, well, the two in the middle. You can see there the inner garment. So this is a very common type of clothing. Jesus taught in Matthew 5:40 that love made personal rights secondary to the needs and desires of others. So, Palm Sunday, oftentimes we'll read the scripture that talks about they bought palm branches and put their cloaks, which was a very much a mark of honor of the person that would be on that donkey riding through. Now, why did they honor the Lord that way when he was riding through on the donkey? Why did they honor him that way? Triumphal entry. Yeah, they thought he would, because that was the Old Testament prophecy that they were familiar with, and they thought that he was on his way to set up the earthly kingdom at that point in time. They didn't understand the huge gap of time between the first and second advent. And even the disciples, up until after the death and resurrection, did not understand. Wilt thou set up the kingdom at this time? And that was uppermost in their minds. To them, that's why the Messiah would come. Number 6 there, purple was dye extracted from the shellfish. And purple was the prized color of Israelites. Then there's the inner garment, which we already talked about a little bit, but the most basic garment, it functioned as a long shirt, a very long shirt. Anybody want to guess what it was made from? Well, that would be, if you came up with the right answer, that'd be pretty amazing. Lynn and I could understand, but oftentimes wool. Why did that surprise me, that an inner garment would be made out of wool? Yeah. Maybe that's all they had available to them. I don't know, but it used warmth, sure. Yeah, it would definitely provide warmth. But why the inner garment? Why not the outer garment? Well, I don't have the answer to that. They don't have the belt. Also sometimes called, what was it called in the Bible time? Old Testament, New Testament. Remember what the belt was called? Belt. You don't see the word belt in at least girdle. When you think of girdle, you think, wow. But it girded up. That's why it's called a girdle, not what we would think of today. So we all know with these long outer garments, if they were going to do something that required physical activity, they would gird up the hem of their garment. And so that would be what we would call a belt. They called it a girdle. Its basic function was, number 1 there, to hold up long clothing, to permit ease of movement. And we have the example of 1 Kings 18:46. And he girded up his loins and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So if you were involved in some kind of athletic endeavor, some kind of work, maybe going out to battle, you were told to gird up the loins. And otherwise you'd get all tripped up, all tangled up in your long garments. So sometimes, when in mourning, people would sometimes use sackcloth made of goat hair. What do you think about that? If you thought wool was scratchy, goat hair is coarse. And why in the world would they do that? Well, 1 Kings 20:32a, so they girded sackcloth on their loins and put ropes on their heads and came to the king of Israel and said, Thy servant Ben-Hadad saith, I pray thee, let me live. So when a person was in mourning, it practically guaranteed misery to the wearer. And so this was an outward form to let people know that they were in mourning. And remember how Jesus rebuked the Pharisees sometimes for their outer signs of mourning? Anybody remember? Not mourning necessarily, but anybody remember what I'm referring to? Fasting. They would disfigure their faces and things like that, and it was mainly just to draw attention to themselves. But you remember a lot of times in the Bible where people would put on sackcloth and rend their garments sometimes and put ashes on their heads, all kinds of things like that. Were they trying to draw attention to themselves? No. Part of it was ritual, but part of it was just to let people know that they were in mourning. And so you'd be careful maybe, how you approached them, what you said to them, how you responded to them. Hopefully you would exercise or extend courtesy to them. Peter told believers, number 3 there, to gird up the loins of their minds. What do you think he meant by that? Now, the typical Jew would have known exactly what he was talking about. But how do you gird up the loins of your mind?
Thoughts that aren't true.
Okay, aren't true? Yes, absolutely.
Prepare, prepare your mind.
Okay,
Be alert, and that's what they're doing. They're preparing to be able to.
sure, sure. Good answers. Yes, and it wouldn't have to be something necessarily wrong or untrue, but just an obstacle, something that would hinder them as believers. And of course, the key word there is your mind. It's amazing how much the Bible has to say about our minds and thinking. We have to be transformed by the renewing of our minds in order that we might prove what is good, acceptable, and holy before God. So gird up the loins of your mind. Headgear. That was a pretty, very common. Today you see a lot of people that don't wear hats, but back then pretty much everybody was wearing a hat, even though headdresses are rarely mentioned in the Bible, but practically everyone wore some kind of a head covering. One of the most popular headdresses was called the head square. It was often white, and it would be folded in a triangle with a pointed end stretched down the back of the wearer's neck like a scarf, held in place by a piece of rope or a cord which circled the top of the head. On a hot day, it protected the neck from the rays of the sun, and it had considerable versatility. It could shade the eyes from bright sunlight, quickly be converted into a face mask if a dust storm developed, which would be fairly common back in those days. So practically everyone wore some kind of head covering. One of the most popular was the head square or scarf, and many Jewish women wore a veil. We've already mentioned footwear somewhat a couple of weeks ago, but again, that was a pretty important part of Jewish life. There were 2 types. One would be sandals, one would be shoes. And sandals in those days looked a whole lot more like sandals in our day, obviously not as elaborate, homemade, of course. The soles of these sandals were made of a hard material such as palm bark or rush, and then leather straps secured to the sole of the wearer's foot. It was not unheard of, but very rare for people to wear any kind of socks, and mostly just on bare feet. So remember John the Baptist, what he declared himself unworthy to do? Yeah. Unworthy to unloose the straps on his sandals in John chapter 1, verse 27. Removing the sandals of a guest was the job of a slave or another lowly figure in the house, or someone who humbled himself to assume that role. So when John talked about that, that's what entered the Jewish person's mind. They knew exactly what he was talking about. Otherwise, we read that and we think, well, why would he say that of all things? Why would he want to untie Jesus' shoe or sandal? Well, that's the answer to that question. It was a sign of humility, and so I'm not worthy to do that. I'm not even worthy to do that. Taking on the role of a slave, and not even that. So, shoes, number 2 there, were similar to our high ankle boots. And high ankle boots. Some people have lots and lots of those, and they clutter up people's doorways in the front door oftentimes, but not back then. You didn't have 13 pairs of ankle boots plus a whole different other kinds of shoes either, right? Did somebody say, Okay. Now, these were often made of soft leather, and they were usually from either camel or a jackal or even a hyena hide. Very soft, very comfortable. And so most likely the people would wear sandals in good weather and shoes when it's cold or maybe damp outside. Some shoes were of the hobnail variety, constructed with nails, used for long journeys, and maybe would kind of answer to our hiking boots that we have today. And traveling seems to have been their major purpose. Number 3 there. It's interesting that it was forbidden to wear these hiking type boots on the Sabbath. Can anybody imagine why? The Pharisees said, nope, don't wear those on the Sabbath. Why? I'm sorry.
They had to be tied.
No. Well, I never thought about that, but that certainly could be a possibility. You don't tie your shoes on the Sabbath. They might be tempted to hike. So, if you want to be real righteous in the eye of the Pharisee, no hiking boots in the temple, or on the Sabbath, rather, excuse me. Forbidden, absolutely forbidden. Now, sandals and shoes play a large role in the Bible. Number 4 there, or 3 rather, traveling seems to have been the main 4. Shoes had to be removed at a sacred occasion. Acts 7:33, then said the Lord unto him, put off thy shoes from thy feet, for the place where thou standest is holy ground. And that was the temple in Acts there. And I think that's speaking about the occasion where the Lord met with Moses way back when. In Acts chapter 7:33, this isn't in your book here, but Boaz, do you remember how Boaz closed the deal to marry Esther? He had to give him a shoe. You think, okay, that's kind of weird. But Here's what my resource says. Boaz closed the deal by offering the shoe provided by the kinsman redeemer. So that just was a custom back then. You know, some of these things we have no answer, just like there's a lot of English euphemisms that we have no idea where they came from. That's a fun thing to think about sometimes. But that was just a custom in those days when you were making a deal like that. As a kinsman redeemer, the man that turned down Esther and the land that would come along with her, Ruth, excuse me. I said Esther, didn't I? Getting my stories mixed up. Ruth, thank you. Had to take off his shoe and give it to Boaz, and that sealed the deal.
They didn't write contracts.
No. Not that I know of. None that I know of except the ones that the Lord wrote, the covenants that the Lord wrote, but 10 Commandments, but I have no record of that in my mind anyway, which usually means nothing, but so number 5, wearing sandals, and we did talk about this a week or two ago, made foot washing necessary. And foot washing was a double sign of hospitality and respect. In Luke chapter 7, verse 38, and stood at his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with ointment. And John 13:5, after that he poureth water into a basin, began to wash the disciples' feet, and to wipe them with a towel wherewith he was girded. And so what was the Lord teaching teaching the disciples when he did that at the Last Supper? What was he teaching them? Why hadn't any of them done that yet? Yes, yeah. And they were probably waiting for the person who was less esteemed than they were. And so, boy, did the Lord ever teach them a lesson in humility and in servanthood. Unfortunately, some people have taken that to an extreme and made it a, what do we call the Lord's Supper and baptism? Ordinance of foot washing. Some religions do that, even today. Is it unbiblical? Well, no. Is it a good lesson in humility? Yes. But if it becomes something that is elevated, to a position of an ordinance or something like that, then obviously it's totally misunderstood and even problematic. Ointments in Psalm 23:5, thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. And again, we did talk about anointing the head with oil a week or two ago. But this was more than just so that the hair would look good or something like that. It was considered to be a special honor. So when a guest came into your house, you would wash their feet, or somebody would. If there was a servant in the house, they would do that. Their hair would be anointed with this expensive ointment, and you would customarily give the guest a kiss. And of course, Simon, when he had Jesus come over, did none of those three, but this woman did, and was greatly commended as a result. So it was a special honor to anoint their heads with oil, and this was done at feast oftentimes by placing a small oil-based cone of perfume on the head of the guest, and then get this, body heat would slowly melt the cone, causing the perfume to drip onto the person's clothing. Interesting. I never heard that before anywhere else but right here. Frankincense was made from a shrub, and myrrh was made from a tree. They would peel off the bark, and the gum resin would provide this substance called myrrh. So when we were in Petra, there was a merchant there selling frankincense and myrrh. Do you remember that? We didn't buy any. We didn't get the point, I guess. But you could buy it there if you wanted to. Jewelry. Oftentimes, you know, 1 Timothy 2:9 refers to this. Women would embellish their hair with combs and hairpins, and some of the more elaborate ones having carved figures, even being made of gold. And so Peter in 1 Peter 3:3, whose adorning, let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair, or wearing of gold, or putting on of apparel. Is there anything wrong with outward adorning or plaiting of the hair or wearing of gold? Anything sinful about that? Or so why the instruction? Yeah. What was more important, especially in the eyes of the Lord, was the inner man of the heart. So there was a lot of elaborate jewelry and clothing and hairdos and hairstyles like that, all attracting attention to the person. And the Lord commended modesty in clothing so that we wouldn't be drawing attention to ourselves. I think that, you know, clothing has two basic reasons. One is modesty, and the other one is protection from the weather, and so on. So why be immodest, you know? Modest dress is highly commendable in the Lord's sight, and it should be in ours as well. So hairstyle, well, beards are made out of hair. Beards were very common. The Lord had facial hair because he spoke of plucking the hair out of his beard. Back on jewelry, here's one interesting thing. Many married men wore a ring on the fourth finger of the left hand. Does anybody know why the fourth finger of the left hand? Yes. I didn't know. Did anybody else know that?
You can also get better oxygen readings on that finger.
Wow. So, good to have a nurse here. That's exactly right. They believed that a vein, and they evidently, how did they know that? A vein ran directly to the heart. The heart, considered, you know, so a symbol of love. Back to hairstyles then. Women often wore their hair piled high on their heads. Wow, when I was in high school, now I know I'm dating myself here, but there was this hairdo that women had like this, and it wasn't an afro. I remember a friend of mine, the first time he saw somebody like that from the back, he thought to himself, that poor girl, she has elephantitis of the head. Some pretty weird hairstyles throughout different times of history. Tight curls were popular. Sounds like the Roaring '20s. Also elaborate braiding and plaiting of the hair. What is plaiting? I don't even know what plaiting is. Same as braiding?
So it's kind of more like, I think it's like braiding and incorporating the hair at the same time, so it's actually close to the head, but it's tight, it's in a braid.
Okay. Number 4, gray hair was honored in Israel. Proverbs 20:29. The glory of young men is their strength, and the beauty of old men is the gray head. And if gray was honorable, then white much more so. Oh, that's not on the notes, is it? You probably didn't know that. I'm just kidding. Pastor told me about a year ago, there was somebody who was watching our services live stream, and really enjoying the services and commending Pastor John on his preaching. And then he said to him, kind of as a PS, oh, by the way, that silver-haired guy is pretty good too. So, Tom, we're the silver-haired guys, right? Medical practices. And I only have about 5 minutes left, so we'll just get as far as we get in 5 minutes, and we'll just stop. Top of page 8, many sicknesses were incurable and highly contagious. The medical community in Palestine included highly trained physicians as well as magicians. We read about a magician in the book of Acts, also charlatans. So a patient in need of help could receive anything from first-class assistance to a magic potion or absolute poison. And so this explains why doctors received mixed reviews in the New Testament. So if a person desired to practice medicine, there was ample opportunity. Jesus was continually met by hordes of crippled, maimed, blind, diseased, and mentally disturbed and distorted people. Many sicknesses were incurable and highly contagious, which we already said. Medical knowledge, number 2, was too limited to keep up with the spreading sicknesses, Mark 6:56. And whithersoever he entered into villages or cities or country, they laid the sick in the streets and besought him that they might touch, if it were, but the border of his garment. And as many as touched him were made whole. Doctors. There were many highly trained physicians. There were also magicians and charlatans. I already said that. The Lord alluded to a well-known proverb of his day in Mark 4:23, and he said unto them, Ye will surely say unto me this proverb, Physician, heal thyself. Whatsoever you have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in thy country. And so, there's a common saying back in Jesus' day, physician, heal yourself. What did he mean by that? What does it mean, physician, heal yourself? If you're a real doctor, what would you think of a doctor that mended bones and had a crooked arm or something like that, you know? If you can't heal yourself, how can you heal other people? And so they were throwing that out sometimes as an insult or a sign of proof. If you are who you say you are, heal yourself. Charlatans. A license was required to practice medicine in Palestine. And it's interesting that Egyptian medicine, a lot of doctors would go to Egypt in order to study medicine. And many of their remedies that they taught way back then are still practical and useful even today. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus gives us insight into Egyptian medical knowledge. This document lists 48 cases of injury, including treatment for 10 possible injuries to the brain, etc. Broken bones were set and a special adhesive plaster cast was applied. Skeletons show evidence of well-healed fractures. And we know there were general physicians, mental therapists, dentists, gynecologists, and obstetricians. Did I say that right? Also, many occultists who claimed to be able to heal. So, under C medical schools, extensive training was available. And for example, Luke was well known as a physician. 2, I already answered. The most famous school that day was in Egypt, founded about 3000 BC. Many of the remedies useful even today. And then 4, a license was required to practice medicine in Palestine. I think I'll just finish this section up, surgery. Doctors had a wide range of surgical instruments, including knives, scalpels, tweezers, saws, that sounds a little scary, and clamps, which made possible many surgical procedures. And get this, Jewish surgeons were able to remove cataracts. They also cut squares into the skull and performed some types of brain surgery. So doctors had a wide range of surgical instruments. They were able to remove cataracts, perform brain surgery, and sleeping potions were used as anesthetics. Well, I remember a Civil War. They didn't have anything. They'd give a guy a bullet to bite on and saw part of their leg or arm off. And then F, we'll close with this, oils and wines. These were probably the most common home remedies. Luke 10:34, and went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. Why oil? Why would you pour oil into a wound? Yeah. And why wine? Disinfectant. Yeah. And in Mark 6:13, and they cast out many devils and anointed with oil many that were sick and healed them. And of course, we all remember that Paul prescribed the use of wine to Timothy. In 1 Timothy 5:23, drink no longer water, but use a little wine for thy stomach's sake and thine often infirmities. They also had false teeth made out of wood. Anybody know anybody in American history that had some like that? Yes, and sometimes gold or silver. Okay, there was something else I wanted to say about the wine, but I'm not finding it at this point, so I won't. Oh, here it is. The admonition to take a little wine for the stomach probably referred to the custom of mixing wine with water to kill the numerous bacteria and organisms that are still troublesome in the Middle East. So that would help us understand better why Paul told Timothy, take a little wine. I always thought maybe that'd make his stomach feel better or something. But from what we learned from Jewish history, it was more to kill the bacteria and the little bugs floating around. They didn't have the ability to do that we have today, and so that's what they would do instead. So that oil and wine, two of them was common. Okay, that's all we have time for tonight. Any questions, comments? Yes, Dick?
This is kind of off the subject, but do you know when writing and reading actually took place? Where did it start? Anybody have an idea?
Well, the Lord wrote on the 10 Commandments. He wrote on the tables of stone, so they had to be writing by then already. Did anybody think of examples before that? That's way back in Exodus.
Did it start in Egypt?
That I don't know. I probably used to know, but I don't remember. We know shortly after the fall, there was the invent of all kinds of musical instruments. There was metallurgy, and boy, they had the ability to do things had really, of course, the effects of the fall weren't as pronounced then as they are now, as we've passed down from generation to generation. But I would tend to believe that writing would have been one of those. But that's a good thing to think. Good question, Dick. If they had the ability to do all those other things, it seems to me like they would also. Obviously, they spoke to each other. So why would they not have formed an alphabet and?
Well, Moses wrote about the history of creation. What was it, 2,200 years after it actually took place?
Yeah. Well, you know certainly by then, because Moses wrote, didn't he?
Here it says writing began 3400 to 3200 BCE. I don't know if that's before Christ or not. In ancient Mesopotamia, specifically with the Samaritans, who developed a system known as cuneiform,
Cuneiform, yeah.
3400 to 3200 BC.
That's a long time ago, Dick. Yeah.
There was more writing before the flood, and then with the death of most peoples, a lot of that knowledge was lost. And so it kind of had to start over.
I'm sure there was a ton of starting over. Think about it. All those people that specialized in the different trades and abilities and so on.
Actually, with that date of 3,400, that's not too much after the flood took, or after creation.
Creation, right? If Usher's dates are correct. That'd be about 800 years after creation.
But if it was invented by the Samaritans, it had to be after the Jews were born, because Samaritans didn't come until mixed between
Sumerians.
Sumerians, oh, okay.
So that was 3,400 years before. Okay, thank you.
And your hat was called a kippah or a yarmulke? Is that little round hat, is that what you're talking about? Yeah. A kippah?
I'll try to remember to bring that next week, but you probably have all seen one anyway, so.
I saw a bunch of little boys even at Aldi's wearing them. They brought a school of little Jewish boys in.
We saw a Jewish man at the vet's hospital a short time ago, and I wanted to say to him, we support Israel, but there was all kinds of other people around. I felt like it'd be pretty embarrassing to him, so we didn't. But Lord does tell us to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, doesn't he? Okay, thank you all. Thank you for coming, and
Next week we have family.
thank you for reminding me of that. Next week, family service, so I get a night off, sort of.
No, you have to get family.
Yeah, I do have to be here. Okay, you are dismissed. I dismissed church this morning. I just stayed.
I'd be like thinking it would be 600